Our guest today is Morgan Fox. He's the Media Relations Director for the National Cannabis Industry Association. Founded in 2010, the NCIA is the oldest, largest, and most effective trade association representing legal cannabis businesses. Their membership is composed of hundreds of forward-thinking businesses and tens of thousands of cannabis professionals from coast to coast. The NCIA is leading the charge to protect the legal cannabis industry, defend our state laws, and advance federal policy reforms. As a professional cannabis policy reform advocate and communications specialist since 2008, Morgan has been featured in hundreds of print, radio, television, and online outlets, and has been directly involved in dozens of successful state ballot initiative campaigns, as well as legislative victories at both the state and federal levels. He was most recently the Director of Communications at the Marijuana Policy Project before becoming the Chief Spokesperson for the NCIA in 2018. Morgan, we're really honored to have you join us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I'm glad that phone connection worked out for us, too. Glad you could be here. It sounds fine to me, so good. Such an incredible time for the cannabis plant. Thanks really for being here. You've been advocating to end prohibition personally for about 13 years, right?
Yeah, that's right. Pretty much as soon as I got out of college, I came down to D.C. and started working at an internship to end cannabis prohibition. And, wasn't really sure that I wanted to do that professionally, but once I got into the field, I just was completely sucked in by how many nuances and complexities with this particular policy issue connect so many other areas of life.
And so you started right with the Marijuana Policy Project, and that was in around 2008, right? Were you at the Playboy Mansion that year for the fundraiser? Cause,
not that year, no.
Okay. Because
I went a couple of times, and I was almost always just being given necessary administrative jobs. So not as fun as you would think.
Gotcha. And well, I was there in 2008, so thought maybe we ran into together. But anyway, so from there, how did you get your start with Marijuana Policy Project? Was it just a random thing, or was there a specific policy that drew you into this industry?
Well, actually, the way that I got into cannabis policy reform just overall was because of experiences with the criminal justice system. After getting popped for possession in both high school and college, I realized that the penalties associated with this behavior and with this substance that's objectively safer than alcohol just did not make any sense whatsoever. But the thing that really galvanized me was going to court and seeing that people that didn't look like me were getting way harsher sentences and fines and way longer probation for the exact same thing. And when I started looking into the history of how prohibition has been enforced, disproportionately when it comes to racial and economic standards, then I realized that it was something that I really wanted to get more involved with. So when I graduated college, I started looking around for any sort of employment I could in the D.C. area that was working on these sort of issues. And Marijuana Policy Project was gracious enough to take me on as an intern, and basically just been doing this ever since. I just keep climbing up to more stress level involvement.
Now, Morgan, you call yourself a policy geek. Is that a specific major you take in college? Is there a certain skill set that you have to do to prepare for that?
Well, technically, I guess I'm a communications professional, and that was definitely not exactly what I was trying to do when I was in school. But I actually started out as trying to work in physics and astronomy, and realized that the math was just too hard after about 3 years. But realized I was doing all right in my poli-sci classes, and then when I switched majors, it just opened everything up for me.
I had a similar story.
Political science is definitely what helped out, preparing me for this journey.
Gotcha. Now, your current journey with the National Cannabis Industry Association, can you give us a little bit of understand of who you represent or who this organization represents? Who are your members?
So we started out in 2010 realizing that there was a nascent cannabis industry in states with regulated medical programs, but they didn't really have a political voice. And they desperately needed one because they were being raided on a regular basis. Not to mention the fact that they actually did have revenue coming in that could be put towards good purposes in terms of lobbying and promoting cannabis policy reform, whereas previously it had largely been very small dollar donors or super rich, more like libertarian-leaning philanthropists. So getting industry players involved in it, even though they technically weren't even really considered to be a legal industry or legitimate to nearly the extent that they are now was really the impetus to starting this organization. And I came on about 8 years in because I wanted to help promote that idea of business people who are benefiting from cannabis actively working towards policies that would not only help us bring an end to prohibition sooner, but would also create a vibrant craft industry that focuses on small businesses. And that's basically what we do.
So what kind of businesses are members? Are they all cannabis businesses?
So we've got about 30% plant-touching businesses, and the rest are primarily ancillary businesses that provide services to those businesses or in areas that kind of are tertiary to the cannabis industry itself. And, I think that is a real big indication of the type of economic opportunity that this industry presents.
Who's the most surprising business that's a member?
Yeah, I mean, well, when you think about it, there's really only, maybe 20,000 cannabis licenses, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little less. It's always shifting throughout the entire patchwork of legal cannabis markets in this country. And there are so many needs that they have to fill. Everything from HR to plumbing to general contracting, facilities design, the list goes on and on and on. So it's really not that surprising when you think about it in terms of it being a legitimate agricultural commodity and industry like any other, and all of the various different types of businesses that interact with those businesses. I mean, for every dairy farmer, there's probably 20 or 30 different businesses that they have to interact with on either a direct contractor vendor basis or as people that are feeding them technology and resources and the tools that they need to be the most successful. So, that's kind of why it breaks down like that.
Gotcha.
Also, the fact that we primarily focus on small businesses, which generally have much less vertical integration and much less ability to take care of all of their various needs in-house. It creates an ecosystem where there's a lot of opportunity for small actors in dozens of different types of fields.
That was Morgan's song selection. Good suggestion, Morgan. Tell us why you chose Peter Tosh, Nah Goa Jail.
Well, I mean, when it comes down to it, that's what these efforts for cannabis policy reform are really about, to stop people from going to jail and getting arrested and facing the lifelong collateral consequences of arrest. But as we get closer to that goal, we do have to consider all of the other side stream effects of that, including making sure that the economic opportunities created by regulated cannabis markets are available for everyone, and particularly the people that have been disproportionately targeted by enforcement of our cannabis policies.
Amen. And we're going to get into that. And before we get into the details, we want to remind everyone here we're talking with Morgan Fox, Media Relations Director for the National Cannabis Industry Association. And Morgan, vocabulary is very important, especially when you're talking about policies and the words that are used. Before we get into the details, I wanted to clear some things up for our audience because it's confusing. You have cannabis, you have hemp, you have marijuana. You worked for Marijuana Policy Project. Now it's the Cannabis Organization. How do these words impact the policy that's currently on the table? And is it finally using one word, or is there still some mix that we can expect?
So if we're talking about federal policy, the definition of hemp is anything that is grown from the cannabis sativa L plant or cannabis ruderalis that has less than 0.3% 0.3% THC content. Specifically Delta-9 THC. And cannabis as a blanket term covers everything else. I think people use marijuana and cannabis interchangeably, but cannabis is the more technical term and the term that I like to try to stick to as much as possible. For many, many years, marijuana was the best term to use in terms of political advocacy because that was the term that lawmakers understood. But I think that now we've gotten to a point where this issue is becoming so widespread and so commonplace and, for lack of a better word, almost boring, that politicians actually know what you're talking about when you say, "Hi, I represent the cannabis industry," as opposed to the cannabis industry? Could you say that again?
Well, so speaking of what's going on currently, let's get into the current administration and what's happening. So how does, especially in D.C., well, specifically in D.C., how's Joe Biden feel about this?
I mean, Biden, for better or worse, is kind of just taking a hands-off approach on this. It's clearly not a priority issue, and unfortunately, this is something that we see across the board, not only with lawmakers and elected officials, but even with voters and even including diehard supporters of cannabis policy reform. The support is very broad, but very shallow. It's definitely not a priority issue for this administration. And honestly, I think that that's kind of a political misstep. This is something that enjoys bipartisan support, although strongly favoring on the Democrat side and the Libertarian side than on the Republican side. It's still majority support across pretty much every political demographic. You start getting into some interesting territory when you look at age and things like that. But this is an issue that has more than 2/3 support nationally, and hard pressed to find an issue that has that much support these days. But it's just not the most pressing issue for even the most diehard supporters, with a very small exception of single issue voters. So there's not really a lot of incentive for the administration to really dive into this. And the president is also coming from a place of being an old school drug warrior. He has definitely evolved over the last few decades, and I think recognized some of the mistakes and some of the harms that his policies that have caused. But it's really hard to get people to change their minds on this issue when they've been stumping for one particular position for decades, and in some cases kind of made their political careers on it. That being said, while this might not be a priority for the Biden administration, I find it hard to imagine a world in which he would veto comprehensive or incremental cannabis policy reform that gets to his desk.
Is Kamala in line with him?
She's actually a much bigger supporter. She was, prior to taking over the vice presidency, the Senate sponsor for the MORE Act, which did not get a vote in the Senate last year, but did pass the House, largely along party lines. But I think that's mostly attributable to the fact that there was just so much partisan rancor in the last few months of last year. Across the board, there are tons of people in the administration that are very much in favor of descheduling cannabis and regulating it. And those voices are going to continue to be heard within the White House. So again, like I said, I don't necessarily see this being an issue that the president personally is going to be a cheerleader on, but I don't see a situation in which he vetoes anything moving in a positive direction, particularly since most of these things, and particularly the incremental reforms like the Safe Banking Act, have bipartisan support. So it's a real opportunity to show that both sides of the aisle can work together on something that the American people, with an overwhelming majority, support.
Now, so speaking of the Senate, real quick, so how does Schumer's bill fit in?
So Schumer's bill is the first real homegrown descheduling bill that has ever been, come up in the Senate. Companions to the MORE Act have been introduced, but they never really went anywhere. And I guess I should point out that no bill has actually been introduced yet. The draft language after Schumer and Senators Booker and Wyden announced that they were making this a priority issue for this session in the Senate, finally released draft language, and it showed that there was a lot of engagement in the drafting process. And then immediately afterwards said that we were going to be accepting comments on this. So NCIA and basically talked to a ton of our stakeholders, all different sizes of business, all different types of businesses, advocacy groups, scientists, public policy experts, tax economists, and condensed that information into what we consider to be a pretty good commentary, but just really the start of the conversation. At some point in the future, we're going to be planning on submitting a line-by-line, red line document to Senate leadership to show them what stuff we need to get taken out and what should be added, or where there are alternative provisions that could be proposed. But the feedback that these offices got was just huge, from every single stakeholder and involved advocacy group across the board. And so now we just have to wait to see what the final language actually looks like. And then, of course, that won't be the final language. There will be possibilities to amend this bill throughout the committee hearing process going forward. But I think that it's definitely a sign that things are moving in the right direction. This has never really happened, with such force in the Senate before, and certainly not with the blessing and direct involvement of Senate leadership in either party. So definitely a big step in the right direction, and shows that they're being thoughtful about the issue.
Yeah, that's good. Now, would it make sense? I know we don't have too much time today, but to break down some of these issues that are on the table in this bill, either that or is there any other avenues that you think are worth talking about other than the this bill? If there's anything going on in appropriations process that may be worth talking about.
Well, there's certainly a lot going on in appropriations, but because of the nature of appropriations, it's only temporary measures. But it's looking very possible that there will be a prohibition on the Department of Justice spending any money to investigate or target state legal cannabis businesses. In terms of medical, that's been the law of the land, at least in terms of appropriations, and been renewed every year since 2014. But it hasn't been extended to adult use recreational markets yet. And we're pretty confident that it will be this year. There are also a number of other research provisions and things related to immigration and veterans access that we're hopeful will be included as well. But again, it's looking very much likely that we're going to see a continuing resolution. So we'll see exactly what that looks like.
All right, good. So then the
standalone legislation. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so then the question I have, just to condense the time here and to make sure we can hit these issues, is the items that are heavily contested in this bill from the Senate, this draft legislation. Are there any ones that are more contested than others? And can you touch on some of those?
Yeah, one of the things that everybody has been looking at is the tax rates. I think that their hearts were in the right place, but also failed to account for the continuation and relative economic power of unregulated cannabis markets. And so when you really break down the tax rates that are contained in the CAOA or Schumer's bill, it would be as bad or worse than the current state of affairs under 280E, whereby businesses cannot deduct business expenses on their federal taxes. And this would put all, particularly small businesses, at a competitive disadvantage. But there are also a number of factors that would put U.S. businesses at a competitive disadvantage in the international market, especially as we're looking at a lot of other countries starting to open up production, if not opening up their own regulated markets internally.
Morgan, who's fighting to keep prohibition in place?
On the state level, it generally tends to be law enforcement organizations, not rank-and-file police officers generally, but sheriff's associations and other groups that tend to get a lot of funding from both federal burn grants, which are based on the number and type of bust that you make, but also are pretty much addicted to asset forfeiture funds in order to stay powerful and relevant. You also get a lot of people from the addiction treatment side of things who might have sweetheart deals with the state in order to get referrals that then patients have to pay for, even if they don't necessarily have problematic drug issues. At the federal level, it really comes down to an age demographic. There are a lot of people in power in Congress who, both Democrat and Republican, grew up during the era of reefer madness, and that's all they've heard throughout their entire lives. And it's very difficult to get them to change their minds about this issue. But I think that people are starting to realize, and as the knowledge about the harmful effects of prohibition and the successes of state legal cannabis markets are starting to be just undeniable, we're starting to see a little bit of progress in that area as well. But it's definitely still a difficult battle. And then, as I said earlier, this isn't necessarily a priority issue for a lot of lawmakers. And so, sometimes it's an easy playground for them to carry out partisan disputes as opposed to working across the aisle. But conversely, it's also an easy way for them to agree with people on the other side of the aisle.
Yeah. Well, so the tax issue, and if you always want to know what's going on, you just follow the money. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are proponents for legalizing cannabis because of the tax revenue. Where do you find the revenue from taxes going?
I mean, it really depends on exactly what level you're looking at. So state taxes tend to go towards administrative costs of regulating cannabis, but they also go towards community reinvestment programs and social equity programs, sometimes in the few places where those exist, and it should be many, many more. Oftentimes they'll go towards drug education and law enforcement, or just into general funds. When it comes to the federal government, it's really not codified as a cannabis tax, because technically cannabis businesses are illegal, but it generally goes into just the federal general fund, and then what is done with that from there, only Congress can say. It's kind of spread around all over the place.
Yeah, so the trend is more states are going towards a direction of taking reforming their cannabis policies, and the question is, how do you see the states integrating with the federal policy, or do you see that one will take precedent over the other?
Well, I think like a lot of other industries, it's going to be almost like a partnership, where the federal government provides resources and guidelines and standards for states to follow, but then states still have a tremendous amount of leeway to regulate the substance in the way that they see fit, as long as they're meeting certain base standards, and as long as they are agreeing to participate in basically what would be considered federal compacts regarding some sort of universal standards, like universal labeling, universal symbols, the types of pesticides that are and are not allowed. Things of that nature. So it's definitely going to be a lot of interplay, and that's why it's really important to look at these regulatory issues and to try to spell out as many of them as possible within the language of the law, so that we're not left in a state of limbo for 4, 5, 6 years after cannabis becomes legal at the federal level, but while we wait for federal regulators to catch up and coordinate with the states. And there's already a lot of effort out there from and between states to create certain standards, and my organization is also working on creating standards that we can help guide federal policy making as well.
Yeah. Now, to dig in a little deeper to legalization, the term deschedule, reschedule, decriminalize, this bill is for descheduling. Can you explain that? What does descheduling mean?
I tend not to use the word decriminalize, because I think it's been kind of generalized and a little bit misunderstood. What we really need to be looking at is whether we're talking about descheduling or rescheduling. And rescheduling would be an out-and-out disaster for state legal cannabis markets. Every single retailer would have to register as a pharmacy. It would create a lot of problems at the FDA level in terms of registering plant material for investigational new drug programs, which cost millions of dollars, like things like that. It would just completely decimate the existing and successful regulated markets. Descheduling just removes cannabis from the Schedule of Controlled Substances under the Controlled Substances Act, and then would allow federal agencies to be able to regulate it, similarly to alcohol and other substances. And the bill that Schumer put forth actually does break it down in a very similar way to what we proposed as an organization, which was to have certain products, particularly plant cannabis and impairing or intoxicating products, be regulated by the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or the TTB, and then pretty much everything else be regulated by the FDA, things like topicals and non-intoxicating cannabinoid substances and edibles and things like that, food additives. And that was mirrored very closely in the bill language, or the draft language. It just needs a little bit of tweaking, and I think a lot of advocates have been working very hard to figure out exactly what the best way to do that is. Obviously, there's still going to be a lot of control from these regulatory agencies, both the TTB and the FDA, but we'd like to give them as much of a framework as possible going in, so that they have less work and are able to hit the ground running.
We have some listener questions here that we want to get to before we let you go here. And here's the first question. If Donald Trump were in office, this would be resolved already. Oh, wait a minute. This is from Rod Barowie. Rod Barowie, get that question out of here. Seriously, a serious question here. What's the difference between medical cannabis and recreational cannabis?
It's really just a definition of policy. There are many people that think that all cannabis use is therapeutic or medical, but when it comes to what the law states, usually for medical cannabis, it's defined as being only accessible by somebody who has one of a usually discrete list of qualifying conditions with a recommendation from their physician, whereas adult use programs or recreational, if you preferred that word, are generally where anybody who is 21 years of age or older can purchase cannabis in limited amounts, and in most states can grow a limited number of plants at home.
Okay, good. That leads me into my second question, actually. So we have one here that says, what are the laws for growing cannabis in my home or apartment?
That really depends on what state you're in.
Maryland.
In Maryland. I actually don't believe that home cultivation is legal in Maryland at all.
Okay.
Even if you're a registered patient. The legislation that is currently being considered for an adult use regulated market, I believe, would allow limited home cultivation, but I'm not sure exactly how many plants or what the rules would be. That law hasn't passed yet, unfortunately.
Okay.
For right now, it's state by state. And regardless of the law, what are you seeing enforcement on the home grows? Are you seeing that being enforced? Or is that not something...
It absolutely is, particularly when it might be used as a cover for criminal operations above the legal limit. But in general, even if people are a little bit above the limit by like one or two plants, cannabis is something that's very easy to grow, but very difficult to grow well. So it's not exactly like the average grower is going to be able to make that big of an impact on either the regulated or the unregulated market. At most, they're going to be able to get material for personal consumption and to gift to their buddies. Very similar to the way that craft beer works when people are growing it or brewing at home.
Good analogy. Good analogy. Okay, we got one more question here.
Go ahead.
I heard if I get my medical cannabis card, I need to turn my guns in. Is that true?
That is not true. However, if you are a registered medical cannabis patient, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for you to make future firearms purchases because the ATF does scan through state medical cannabis registries, which is another reason why we need to deschedule this substance, because you shouldn't have to be able, or shouldn't be forced to give up your constitutional rights in order to use the medicine that works best for you.
Got a question here, a fan of the FDA here. The FDA is on the side of big tobacco and big pharma. What makes you believe that the cannabis business will not land in their hands of big tobacco and pharma as well?
Well, I think that, first of all, the mistakes and, honestly, some of the bad behavior that has come from those two industries have been a wake-up call for decades to regulators. And advocates are very well aware of the potential for that and are doing everything they can to make sure that that type of consolidation and that type of sort of oligarchical industry control is directly prevented in any sort of federal legislation that is going to be coming through.
Yeah, let's hope. Let's hope. Well, Morgan, thank you so much. It's been really great talking with you, especially, being in the trenches. It's you can tell. I mean, thank you. We definitely appreciate it. Anything you want to leave the listeners with before you go?
Other than talk to your lawmakers, convince them that this is an issue that they should support. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. If you have a candidate that you'd like to help out in a race, tell them to support cannabis, and they are almost guaranteed to get a couple of points in the polls, no matter what side of the aisle they're on.
Morgan, how do listeners follow your organization and your work?
You can go to thecannabisindustry.org, and we're also available. Just look for National Cannabis Industry Association on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram.